Now, what I'm hoping is the next hour will be a coronavirus-free zone. But I thought actually one interesting positive way to start off the session would be to ask Philip a more general question, which is, hey Philip, tell me one thing that you're looking forward to doing when the lockdown ends.
That's a great question. I think I'm looking forward to knowing what day it is. I've got no cues that tell me what day it is. Without the football on a weekend, I can't tell the weekdays from the weekend. How about you?
I think the one thing I'm looking forward to is I like to do landscape photography, and at the moment there's a kind of a lot of public shaming of people that go out of their house to do anything other than walk the dog or go to the grocery store, and I can completely understand that as well. But it means obviously that trips out to do a sunrise photo shoot, even though I might well be the only person there, is something that I can't do at the moment. So I'm hoping that the first thing I'm going to do as soon as this is over is I'm going to get up at 5 in the morning and go out and do a sunrise photo shoot. So let's move on to the book, and to do that, I think maybe not everybody that's dialing in today will know who I am or who you are. So first of all, could you give us 1 minute about your background, and then I'll do the same.
Sure. I have a PhD in experimental psychology. My emphasis and my thesis was on human speech perception, and also on language acquisition by infants. I transitioned out of an academic setting into business and industry and worked with a Canadian company. I've done UX with a Canadian company, 2 American corporations, a .com startup in London, and then more recently, I've run my own UX consultancy, and I retired from that a couple of years ago, and that's my current status. I'm a retired UX person, and I'm sitting here in Michigan at the moment.
So it's interesting because I think other than the fact that you're retired and sitting in Michigan, it's a fairly similar trajectory to the one I had. So my background is in psychology as well. I've also got a PhD in experimental psychology. And my route into user experience came first of all from getting a job working for BT, which is the UK's telecommunications company. And they had a huge human factors team at the time. This was back in 1990. And at the time it was the largest human factors group, I think, in the world, certainly across Europe. And it was a fantastic place to be at the time because they were doing lots of things like video on demand, such as things like home automation that became mainstream when the internet happened. But at the time that I was there, because it predated the internet, they didn't kind of have an infrastructure for doing it. But I really cut my teeth on lots of really interesting and exciting projects at that time. Then afterwards, I left there and worked for a consulting firm and set up User Focus in about 2000. So we've got a kind of a similar trajectory. So let's talk about the book. And there's a few themes that I wanted to raise with you as conversation starters. And I think one of the ones that's particularly one of the things that I think we got right in the book was there's a number of analogies or metaphors that we use that I know have resonated with people, but there's one in particular, and I think you're the person responsible for the metaphor, so I thought I'd ask you about it, which is one of the things we talk about in the book is to think like a detective, and I think it was you that came up with that analogy. What made you think of thinking like a detective as being useful when it comes to UX research?
It's always difficult to remember where an idea came from. But thinking back, I remember a conversation many years ago with my PhD supervisor. And I have to tell you a little bit about my supervisor. She had an extremely high standard of scientific method, scientific approach. Her her mantra was that there's only one way to do science, and that is perfectly. And I remember her telling me that I must have messed something up, I'm sure I did. And I remember her telling me that everything has to be precisely perfect. That's just the way it is. So not everything has to be perfect. Everything has to be precisely perfect. And there was no alternative, no discussion. That's just the way it is. So she had a very rigorous approach to science and a very rigorous approach to research. I recall her making one student redo 3 months worth of experiments just because she had found a data point that was inaccurate. And her reasoning was, if I can't trust that data point, I don't know if I can trust any of the other data points either. So you've got to do it all again. I also remember her having a running battle with Intel, the chip maker, because she'd bought a computer that had an early Pentium chip in it. And this Pentium chip, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it had the likelihood of making a division error once every 9 billion calculations. And so he was like, well, I don't want it then, if it's gonna be making a mistake. So I mention that because over dinner one time, I asked her, if you were not a speech scientist, what do you think you would be? What do you think you would do? And she said, I think I would make a really good detective because I know how to gather evidence and I know how to put that evidence together to make a case. And that stuck with me. It wasn't so much that her precision and the, being precisely perfect about everything. In fact, in UX, we don't have that luxury. We have to know when to cut corners, or we have to know when to fit our work into a smaller time slot. But that thought of gathering evidence in order to make a case is exactly what we have to do in UX. We're not trying to find someone guilty or innocent, but we are trying to convince others, make a case for change, for design change, or for something else, or maybe challenging an assumption or something. So thinking about the detective analogy, I think at the back of my mind somewhere, it's been there a long time, probably 30 years or so. And then in the book, when we talk in the book, it was useful to pick, I don't really know the procedures for a real life detective. I'm sure if we'd built the analogy around a real life detective, a lot of it would have been sitting in an office doing paperwork. So it was easy to pick a famous fictional detective and work it around Sherlock Holmes.
And the reason I think it's interesting is because we've got our book titled "Think Like a UX Researcher," but you'd think if you bought a book that was titled "Think Like a UX Researcher," it would tell you this unique way that UX researchers think. You think it would be like, well, this is how detectives think, but this is how UX researchers think. But when I follow that analogy through, I don't think there is a unique way that UX researchers think. I think the detective side is certainly one component of it, but I also think you could also say I think you need to think like an explorer. This idea of having to go into different contexts, which is really what good UX research is about, acknowledging that context is such an important part of understanding behaviour. There's also, you could say, you need to think a bit like a doctor, because there's the need to diagnose a problem rather than just or particularly if a patient came to you and was asking for a blister pack of amoxicillin rather than telling you their symptoms, which is often the way it works in UX. We'll find teams come to us with a solution rather than telling us what the problem is. So there's also the element of kind of thinking like a doctor as well. Maybe to some degree, thinking like an actor, because as an actor, you might try to empathise with the characters that you're portraying. You might kind of do method acting to make sure you really understood their lives, live their life, so that you can get insights that you might struggle to get. Maybe thinking like a teacher because you need to persuade and influence the design team. Maybe thinking like a moral philosopher because of all of the ethical issues that we have as well. So I think it's interesting that I can't think of, and maybe it's because it's a new field, user experience, but I can't, I wouldn't say that there's a specific way UX researchers think. I think it's been a more Catholic than that. They've taken ways of thinking from other disciplines, some kind of scientific disciplines and some from the more artistic kind of liberal arts tradition, and kind of combine them in a way that's formed this thing that we call user experience research.
Right, I agree. Yeah, I like those analogies. I think they're very good. And I agree with you. I don't think there is a unique way that UX researchers think. I think to the extent that we are good at our job and we're rigorous in our thinking, critical in our thinking, then I think we are thinking like any other kind of researcher should, whether it's a scientific researcher, a medical researcher, a NASA researcher, or any other kind of person doing rigorous research. But I do think there's a way of thinking that that UX researchers have that should be unique within the company they work for, within the organization that they work for. So not a unique way of thinking per se, but a unique way of thinking, a different way of thinking to others in an organization. And you might remember I sent you a YouTube interview a short while ago between Matthew Syed, who is a sports journalist and an expert on human performance, and Nico Rosberg, who was the 2016 Formula One race car champion. It was an excellent interview, and something they said jumped out at me. It turns out that in one of the Formula One races, Matthew Syed had been a guest at the Mercedes-Benz pit garage, and he'd spent a few hours observing the engineers, the drivers, the strategists, and so on. And it had occurred to him that he was struck by how rigorous the testing of assumptions was in Formula One. The engineers always test all of their assumptions. They live and breathe metrics. They have the wheel gun that they use to put the wheel on has multiple sensors on it so that they get the angle just right to save a split second. He pointed out that in any given lap, there are 16,000 channels of data that they draw from to analyze the car. So these engineers are living and breathing metrics. But it occurred to him to point out that when they communicate with the driver, they communicate as if they were communicating with an artificial intelligence algorithm. They forget that the driver is a human. And Nico pointed out, the phrase he used, which I liked, was that, yes, you're right, he said, the engineers think that the metrics go all the way into the car, all the way into the driver, and they forget that the driver is a human being with emotions, with fears, with anxieties, with competitive instincts, and so on. So Syed's recommendation was that they should employ more psychologists to bridge the gap between the engineers and the driver, so between the machine and the human. And it struck me that that's exactly the unique role we should play in UX. We should bridge the gap between the engineers who necessarily have to think about the code or the metrics and the performance of a system on the one hand, and the user who's the equivalent of the driver.
Another great analogy. I told you I'd learned something. I hadn't thought of that. Good point.
So, although I don't think there's a unique way of thinking. I think there's a unique role in an organisation that we need to think about. So,
Yeah,
and I liked your analogy of wearing different hats, really. So not just a UX researcher hat or even a detective hat, but all the other hats.
Yeah, and I think you take them off and put them on depending on where you are in the life cycle, what it is that you're trying to do at various different stages. You'll adopt those different hats, I think.
So if anyone wants to watch it, I'd recommend watching that video. You'll learn a lot. I'm speaking to the audience members now. So if you go to YouTube and Google Syed, S-Y-E-D, Matthew Syed, and Nico Rosberg, you'll find the interview. You'll enjoy it.
Okay.
David,
sorry.
I agree. You said at the beginning that you had a number of themes, and we tried a number of analogies in the book. And they have some of them have resonated. We've seen them discussed online. We've seen them discussed in book reviews. Another of the analogies we use that I think works reasonably well is the analogy between observing animals in a zoo versus observing animals in a safari or on a safari. What are you thinking about that? How have you found that useful?
I think that my I'm a little bit like a reformed smoker in the sense that, you know, when somebody gives up smoking, they become absolutely passionate about not being near anyone that smokes or being in smoky atmospheres and so on. That they become a kind of a zealot for it. Well, when I first started out in my user experience career, I don't think I realised how important field research was. And subsequently, I've become an absolute zealot for that. So let me give you some background. So, like you, my first degree was in psychology. Like you, it was in experimental psychology as well. And if I think back to the kind of the research that I did in my psychology degree, it would all be lab-based. So, you know, we would do research in a lab. We'd get students, and it normally was students in to be participants. But it was the research was always taking place in a laboratory. That was kind of, and the reasons for that were obvious, because you want to control variables, which is important as a psychologist. And although there was some field research that went on, mainly in social psychology, it was always considered to be second rate compared to the lab research. And I think probably because the lab research allowed you to be more precisely perfect than the field research would allow you to do. And what I discovered was when I started, what that meant for me was that when I first started in my career in user experience, the natural methodology that I gravitated to is usability testing, because a usability test is just like a psychology experiment. You know, you bring in your participant does the behaviors that you want them to do. In a usability test, obviously it's doing tasks with an interface. You observe them, make observations, and then you analyze the data afterwards. So that's a very easy step for me to make. And it was only as I worked on more projects and I discovered that the usability testing, although it was improving the products I was working on, products were still being released with big gaps in them, because there were things we hadn't realized people wanted to do with them. Because you're never going to discover that in a usability test, are you? You know, your usability test, you ask people to do tasks, and if you don't ask them to do the tasks that they want to do, then you're not going to find that problem with the system. So then I gradually realised that this whole field of design ethnography was important too. You know, it's like, you know, back in the 30s, Kurt Lewin, the psychologist, had this famous kind of equation that behaviour, or I think B equals FPE. Behaviour is a function of the person and the environment. And that, when I recalled that, and obviously that was something that I also came across as a psychologist, it made me think, well, you know, I need to do a bit more field research. So although I wanted to do that, I don't know what your experience is, but I found that trying to sell field research to clients is a big ask. Trying to sell a usability test is easy, because someone's got a product, and you say, I'm going to put that in front of users and tell you where the problems are. There's got so much self or face validity that everybody goes for that, and that's an easy sell. When it comes to field research, this idea that you need to step back, you want to check that you're actually addressing the right user needs. I'd find clients would scratch their heads and they wouldn't really understand why do that. We've got a product already. Let's just test the product that we've got. So I've tried in my time lots of different ways of expressing why it's useful to do that. And the zoo safari analogy, this is a very long-winded introduction to an answer to your question, but the zoo safari analogy, I think, is one way of doing it. So the idea is, let's say that you wanted to observe normal animal behavior. Let's say that you're interested in studying chimpanzee behavior, let's say. Well, you could go to a zoo, and if you did, you would learn things. You'd learn the way the animal walks, for example. You might learn something about social hierarchies in chimpanzees as well from watching them in a zoo. But if you wanted to watch some of the more important behaviours, such as, for example, how they forage for food, how they hunt as a troop would be another example. The only way you're going to discover that is to actually go out into the wild and see them behave normally. Because if you just restrict yourself to observing observing monkeys or animals inside a zoo, you also discover that animals in that situation, they suffer from a particular syndrome called zoochosis, where they have these kind of odd repetitive behaviours, things that you wouldn't normally expect to see in the wild, but happen because those animals are cooped up. And you get a similar thing in user research as well. You find that people behave in a way that may not be natural when you take them out of their environment. So I've tried lots of different analogies in my time to try and get people to understand that context is a skeleton key for understanding user needs. And I think the zoo safari analogy is probably the closest I've got to people saying, "Oh yeah, I kind of get what you mean now."
Don't you also find that field research just feels more interesting? It feels more exciting. I get much more excited doing field research because I am exploring and I don't know what I'm going to find. And I think that's important. I think we don't know what we don't know, and we're very limited if we think we can get there just by asking questions or surveys or even focus groups where people are given questions to answer and to talk about. In those situations, you have to know the question to ask. So you can only ask about what you already know.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Going into when I think of the different environments I've been in with my colleagues, and you have probably as well, obviously into people's homes and offices, but we've been into factories, we've observed production lines, we've observed food bottling machines or drinks bottling machines that you couldn't possibly, we wouldn't be in a position to do any kind of group discussion about, because we don't know we don't have the expertise of that very complex system.
But kind of related to that, it's to do with I think the context helps people remember what matters to them as well. So if you're doing research, I remember the project that you were talking about, working in a bottling plant, and if you took the people that were using that bottling plant machine, and crikey, it's a machine, isn't it? It's the size of a warehouse. But anyway, so it's one of the biggest machines I think that you could work on.
It's the only machine, it's the only product I've worked on that has got a ladder built on the side of it so you can get to the second floor.
So situation like that, taking people out of the situation that they're in and say interviewing them, or even doing, you could do very good, there are alternative research methods obviously to focus groups and so on to get inside people's heads that you could use. But all of them suffer from the same problem, which is that if users aren't in context, they don't then have those triggers. I think in psychology it's called kind of embodied learning. The fact that you learn things because of the stuff that's around you, the actions that you're doing with your body, the postures that you're in, for example. It reminds you. There's another. It's related to state dependent learning. I think I don't know if it was Alan Baddeley, but some memory researcher discovered that people were, if you trained deep sea divers on a memory task, they were better, and you trained them while they were underwater, they were better at the recall task if they were also underwater than if you asked them to recall them out of it. So that kind of state-dependent learning, I think it all feeds into this idea of why context matters, and that without the context, it becomes very difficult for you to really understand the user's needs. And I'd agree with you that I think it's more interesting research too. I think I always enjoy a usability test, but it can become a bit of a grind after the participant, fifth or sixth participant, because you're often discovering the same kind of things. But when you do field research, rather than understanding the product, what you're understanding is the user. And I think people are interesting, people are fascinating, and when you get in context with them.
And I think you have a greater depth of understanding of a problem that you're trying to solve by getting out there. I mean, imagine going back to thinking like a detective. I don't think there's I know there's no point in any of the Sherlock Holmes canon where Holmes turns to Watson and says, I've got it, Watson. We need to run a survey. We need to survey 1,000 people and ask them, are you the murderer? And if somebody says yes, we'll arrest them. It sounds ludicrous when you think of it like that.
He could have run a focus group, I guess, couldn't he? He could have got all of the potential suspects in a room and run a focus group with him.
In an Agatha Christie style movie, yeah. So he would always go to the crime scene. Any detective would go to the crime scene. I have a nice example. I was chatting with a colleague of mine a short while ago, and she works for a company that makes domestic appliances. And one particular noisy customer had complained that their I can't remember what product it was now, but it was some kind of portable device that was actually intended to go in a basement, but this person had put it in a kitchen, and it was making a very high-pitched noise, and it was disturbing them and annoying them, and they'd called up to complain. And the development team had asked my colleague to see if she could get to the bottom of this by setting up a survey and interviewing all of the other, or a lot of the other customers who had the same product, find out what they think. Do they find it annoying? Which actually is a very difficult thing to do without tipping your hand. It's hard to ask. It's hard to get at the question of, you can't ask them, do you think the noise is annoying, because you've just shown your hand and biased the question. So instead of doing that, she managed to arrange to go along to the house where the person had the problem. And the first thing she noticed was that they'd installed it in the kitchen when it was really the designer's intent was to install it in a basement where the sound wouldn't have probably been an issue. But nevertheless, it was making this annoying sound. And what she realized was the guy whose kitchen it was had recently spent thousands of dollars on fitting out the kitchen in a very modern style. Everything was white, hard surfaces. It wasn't a sort of cozy, old-style family kitchen. It was super modern. And all of the surfaces in the kitchen were acting like an echo chamber and were amplifying the sound. That's not to say there wasn't a sound to be worried about. There was. But had she just run a survey or a focus group, she would not have discovered the fact that the kitchen environment was amplifying the sound, and it was part of the problem.
I think it relates to that is sometimes people will say to me, well, why do I need to go into context? Why can't I just kind of run an interview instead with people? And I think that there's an analogy I like to, or an example I like to use, which is to put people in a situation and imagine that they had been commissioned by Nescafe or some kind of instant coffee manufacturer, and their job was to try and innovate in the instant coffee space. And then I'll say to them, how might you go about that with an interview? Well, you might say to someone, can you tell me how you go about making a cup of coffee? If you did that, if it was a cup of instant coffee, I'm sure most people would say something like, well, what I do is I put the kettle on, then while the kettle's boiling, I get a cup ready, I'll go to the cutlery drawer, get a teaspoon, put a spoonful of coffee in the cup, then I'll add water and milk to taste. I don't take sugar, but if I did, that's a point at which I would add sugar. And I think that's what you would get from an interview. And then you think, well, then you've got to work out, well, how do you innovate around there? What are really the user's needs? But I think if you went into context, if you went into my context and observed me making instant coffee, it'd look something a bit different. So this is how it'd look in my house. So you'd come in and watch me. I would put the kettle on, and while the kettle's boiling, I'd then go off and at the moment, terror scroll on BBC News and get completely lost in reading about coronavirus. Or I might be on Facebook or something. And then 15 minutes later, I realise that, I was making a cup of coffee. I have to go back and I have to put the kettle back on again to bring it to the boil. And when I go to actually make the coffee itself, I might notice that I don't have any teaspoons because they're always in the dishwasher. So instead I kind of have to tip out a kind of a teaspoon amount of coffee from the jar into the cup. And then when it comes to adding milk, I like to kind of give the milk a quick sniff just to check it's not gone off as well. And all of those kind of behaviours aren't things that you'd hear if you interviewed someone, but you do see when you go into context, and they help you. So, for example, the idea of not realising that the kettle boiled, or the fact that you've missed it, that might say, well, why don't we give a kind of an old school kettle whistle with every pack of instant coffee that people can put on their electric kettle so it makes a noise? Or for the fact that you may not have a teaspoon handy, let's have a kind of a Pez dispenser in the lid of a coffee jar that people could press, and it would release an exact 1 teaspoon amount of instant coffee into the cup. I don't know what we could do about people sniffing the coffee, or sniffing the milk to see if it has gone off or not, but I'm sure there's other things there that give you an idea about how you can, but that the innovation happens when you see real behaviour rather than having people just tell you a kind of a just so story, which isn't always actually the way they do it. Not because they're lying, but they may just forget about a lot of those things.
An important, as you were speaking there, I'm just reminded, an important thing to keep in mind when doing field research, and certainly on a safari, is to keep yourself out of the picture. On a safari, you're gonna have all sorts of problems if the lion or leopard that you're tracking suddenly turns around and there's a whole bunch of people in a tour bus with cameras. And I'm reminded of a study that it wasn't a study we did, it was a study we were given the data from to, we often see what previous work have you done in this area. And we watched the videotapes. One of the findings, this was a study where people were being observed bringing home supermarket shopping in the back of their car and then carrying the shopping through the house into the kitchen, or putting it away wherever you would put it away. Just do whatever you would do naturally. And the team of researchers identified all the places where they would put the shopping down to unpack it or do whatever they would do to sort of stage the setup of the shopping. And it was observed that, I think one of the team members had observed that nobody ever seemed to use the kitchen surfaces. They didn't seem to use the surfaces along the side of the sink there to put anything. Why was that? So we looked at the video, and sure enough, the researchers had piled all their research equipment and their bags and their cameras and their clipboards and things onto these kitchen surfaces. So, that's why they couldn't use it. Nobody used the kitchen surfaces because the researchers had.
Shows you as well, doesn't it? Often you might say, well, go into context because a lab environment changes people's behaviour, and that's a good example of researchers going into context and changing the environment, and as a consequence, changing the behaviour.
And it's not easy. You've got to keep yourself out of the picture. You've just literally got to try and be a fly on the wall, and try and avoid turning it into an interview, because then it's like the author of a play stepping out of the wings onto the stage and having a conversation with the actors halfway through the play. So I think we've alluded to it already to some degree, but thinking about what makes good versus bad UX research is a topic that comes up a lot, and it's certainly something that we wrestled with in the book. What's your take on good versus bad UX research? How would you distinguish it? At a very fundamental level, and not particularly interesting level, most of us think this way, is good UX research will always start by identifying an important underlying research question, important and preferably interesting question, and that question will drive everything you do. But I think the second important thing to consider, so the first thing would be the important question. The second one would be to start thinking not about recruiting or method or any of those other things, but to start thinking about the kind of data that you need to collect in order to answer that question. And I think frequently we allow ourselves to be method-led. We may get a request from the department asking for a usability test or asking for some kind of method. And when that happens, we jump in at the wrong place. We start organising the logistics and recruiting and setting things up. Instead, what we should do is we should start with the data and work outwards from the data. What kind of data do I need? What's valid data? What's reliable data? What will satisfy the conditions of the study? What will satisfy the engineers or the marketing people? Rather than sort of just cranking out some formulaic study. So I think that's a hallmark of good research.
Yeah. So I think I'm aware of the time. I want to make sure we give enough time to address some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. But let me just chip in for a couple of minutes on kind of my take on it. I think that I think in the book we've got a very good article where we've talked about what makes good versus bad. But I think also in terms of an independent person, someone that didn't know much about research, I think there are a few heuristics or guidelines that they could use to determine whether or not it was any good. So, for example, if it was field research, you'd expect good field research to almost certainly have relatively small samples of people, unlike a survey that might have hundreds. You'd expect it to focus on behaviour. You'd expect it to be one-to-one rather than in groups, so that you can really get an in-depth understanding of the individuals. And you'd expect it to be carried out in context. So you could kind of use those as a checklist, even if you didn't know much about research, to see if it was any good. And when it comes to usability testing, I think we could, you'd want to check, obviously, does it involve the intended users of the system? But also, is it task-oriented? Are we giving users real tasks to do? Tasks that they would say, yes, this is the kind of thing that I would expect to do for real. But most importantly, I think, for a usability test is if they're using the thinking aloud method properly. I think one thing that I often see when I see new user researchers do the thinking aloud method is that they'll think that the job of thinking aloud is to get the participant to say what they like and what they dislike, rather than a kind of a stream of consciousness that's going through their heads. So I would say, well, are they using the thinking aloud method properly, which is, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I'm looking for, and so on. Yeah. Let's have a look at the Q&A. Marco, over to you. Give us give us a question from the Q&A.
Thank you, David. Is everybody hearing me correct?
Yeah.
Yes, all right. We've got a lot of interesting questions in the chat, but they're buried in all the other stuff. There are also some questions in the Q&A panel. Lan Van would like to know, do you have any famous detectives or explorers you use as an example?
I'm going to pass that to Philip because I think I know that he does.
Well, I think most Brits, we've gone through 30 odd years of detective TV detectives. There's a sort of genre, particularly in Britain, and it's come across to the US as well. And then America has its own favorite detectives, like Columbo and so on. My favorites, I would, originally Inspector Morse and Lewis. We've started enjoying watching Wallander, some of the Swedish detectives. I don't have a favourite explorer. It's a strange thing to have, isn't it? A favourite explorer. So I don't know how to answer that one. I can name some explorers, but I don't know much about.
Not really. Let's move on. Here's a very long story from Ruben. Perhaps there are some differences in how UX researchers think. Focus on behavioral as opposed to attitudinal data. I'm trying to find the question. All of this might require thinking differently from many other research professionals. It's a long story, but not really a very easy question. There is one that's very urgent right now for the entire industry, and I never thought of this, but this is very important right now. Fatima is asking, with our reality right now of working remotely, and artificial intelligence, and this reality becoming more and more our way of working, how do you see us doing research?
I think that, yeah. So this is. I think this is obviously it's a very important question, particularly at the moment. I think there are two ways that it could go. I've got in my head. I've got this kind of there's one future for UX research which I think would be the wrong direction to head in. And that direction would be to focus very much on remote, unmoderated tools. So, for example, asking people to do usability tests and record themselves and then send the recordings in, or asking people to do remote, unmoderated sessions where we simply measure time on task and whether or not people were successful on the task, or focusing on the web analytics. Basically, I think the point Philip made earlier on, this idea of reducing behaviour to numbers, because numbers are useful. I'm not criticising numbers. I love quantitative data, but behaviour is more than numbers. But I think when you're in this situation, which is, oh, look, we can't go into context at the moment because we literally can't go into context. It's as if governments across the world have said to us, thou shalt no longer do field research, because we literally cannot do that methodology at the moment where we go into the user's context. And as a consequence, I think it's very tempting then to dismiss that and think of field research as only being where we go into the user's context, and as a consequence move to these remote automated methods. I think there's another future which I'm a bit more optimistic about, which is that we start exploring tools that people have been using for a long time to understand the user's context. So one, for example, would be using a diary study, where with a diary study you ask people to literally keep a diary over a period of time, describing how they go about whatever the meaningful activity is that you want to understand. And I think there are techniques like that we can take from the field of ethnography and apply, which don't require us to go into the user's context, but still allow us to understand the needs that they have. And obviously we can also use remote moderated usability tests to see how people are actually interacting with the products and services that we've designed now. because I think the important thing about both those methods is they enable us to really understand why users are doing things the way they're doing. And I think when you completely automate the method and you're not seeing people, when you're not getting eye to eye with people, immediately you're losing insight into what's really going on. I think an analogy I like to use sometimes, I'm big on analogies today, but the analogy I like to use is it's a bit like watching a football game live. When you watch a football game live, you're part of the action, you're really into what's going on, you're really focusing on every element of it. But when you watch a recording of the game, or even worse, you just look at the football score in a newspaper where you've got the number, but you've missed the experience. And often it's the experience of being face-to-face with users. So it is a challenging time, but I think there are methods that we can use that allow us to get over that hump and still get that empathic understanding. And by empathy, I mean a cognitive empathy, understanding why users do the things they do, not feeling sorry for them, but really understanding why they do certain behaviours. I think that there are tools available for us to use those techniques. There's only one proviso I'd add to that, which is at the moment, the context isn't the context. Nobody's life is normal at the moment. I mean, I don't normally spend every hour of the day at home with my family. Normally I'm doing other things as well, such as a bit of photography perhaps. And that's going to be the case for everyone. So at the moment, trying to understand the way people do a meaningful activity is problematic. So I think we need to be out of the lockdown situation before we can start doing this kind of research again. But even then, it doesn't necessarily need to be face-to-face with people. We can use these other techniques.
David, I have a follow-up question to that. You talked about remote moderated studies, and I can see how that could be done and it could be useful. But a lot of UX folks are not working on websites or software or apps, they're working on physical products, where it's much harder to do remote testing. In theory, you could send cameras in and rig up some system like Zoom even to try something. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on.
This is interesting. I think it points to an interesting difference between me and you. So my experience in my consulting career has been almost always around software. I've done some product work, like I did some work on printers for HP, but basically my focus has almost always been on software. And it's curious that your background has almost always been on products rather than software. But I think with current technology, with a mobile phone, somebody could video themselves. People are quite familiar with that now, aren't they? Doing kind of vox pop. So they could set up videos to video themselves. But I'd be the first to admit that as soon as you do that, you're biasing your sample towards people with more technology experience and certainly with more money, people that have got access to those kinds of technologies. At the moment, right now, I'm working on a project with some people in a country in Africa, and the country that they're working in are using desktop computers. They're using mobile phones to access technologies. Things like asking them to set up a remote a usability test is just nonsense because people don't have that technology. So there are certain situations where that's just not going to work, and you do need to be face to face. I mean, have you thought of any solution to that problem about the way you would run or do field research when it's based on physical products rather than software?
If we can't be in the environment, it's just going to be very, very difficult, because even if you were to use, the camera function on an iPhone or any other kind of video system, you have immediately, and this is assuming the user is operating the recording device and trying to do the work, or recording fellow workers, depending on the environment. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic change of context and circumstances and social interaction, having somebody wandering around with a camera, which is not what they normally do. So I think that's going to be quite a difficult one.
I think there's going to be, and I tell you what's interesting is I think there's been a lot of money and investment spent on supporting user researchers with remote usability testing tools. There's very few organisations I know that are doing work on supporting user researchers that want to do remote field study research. Yeah. There's got to be a solution to it, just that nobody's come up with the idea yet. So if there's someone out there who's a bit entrepreneurial, rather than try and compete in that space with companies like UserZoom and so on, who are all focusing on how do you run a usability test, which is that's a very competitive market to do that remotely. I think that there's definitely an area for products which are helping you understand the day-to-day experience of people.
Yes.
Shall we do some few more questions?
Yeah.
Because you guys obviously know quite a lot, but then you also take up a lot of the time to answer one question, and they're actually pouring in. One of the most popular questions is how to choose the right UX metrics by Dill. How do you go about selecting the right metrics? What is success, I think?
Right. So let me go first, Philip. So I think that there's one metric which is always going to be important. It doesn't matter what product it is. It doesn't matter if it's a physical product or if it's a software product. It will be an important metric in 10 years' time, and it was an important metric 10 years ago. And that's task completion. So what percentage of users are successful when they're trying to complete common tasks with your product, service, website, app, and whatever it is. So that's always an important metric. And if we go to the ISO standard, ISO 9241, part 210, there'll be a test later. There are two other key metrics that they have in there. They also talk about efficiency, like time on task. And they also talk about user satisfaction. So how do they feel about the experience afterwards? I don't actually think choosing metrics is the hard thing. I think we know what metrics matter. Can people complete the task? How long do they take? How satisfied are they afterwards? What's difficult is knowing what numbers you should put on those metrics. So how do you decide what a good task completion rate is? If you've got the only product out there and the task completion rate is a paltry 40 or 50%, meaning that only half of the people can complete a key task with your interface, if you've got no competitors, then you're still going to be able to sell your product. Whereas if you're in a much more competitive market where task completion rates are up at 80 or 90%, then you've clearly got to set your metric at a higher level. So
if lives are at stake, the medical profession.
Absolutely, yeah. And so there are other professions as well. So for example, they do have these metrics in when in the evaluation of medical products, and they have a very rigorous methodology for the way those metrics should be collected, including, for example, the number of participants that you should test, and so on. But the like I say, I don't think the metrics. I don't think it's difficult to pick metrics. I think what's difficult is to put numbers on those metrics. Would you add anything to that, Philip?
Just that I've seen companies spend months and months developing metrics, often way too complex to explain to their stakeholders. So if you have to spend a long time explaining the metric and the end result should be somewhat emblematic. It should sort of stand on its own. So task completion rate, people get that. They don't need an explanation. The other thing I found, which can be very problematic, is just companies have these metric-driven methods, and then typically don't really know what to do with the metrics once they've collected them. So it's easy to gather them up and collect the numbers, put them in spreadsheets. But unless you're doing, say, head-to-head competitive analysis with another company's products, where it's obvious what to do, just collecting the numbers you can end up just swamped by data and nobody knows what to do with the metrics. So I would start there. I'd say, what do we need metrics for? and then work backwards.
All right. Can I ask Philip another question? How do we prevent the user from becoming aware that he's being tested and changing his behavior? I was about to read it aloud when it jumped from my screen, but this was the essence of the question.
In reality, if you do field research, for example, so in a usability test, you know, if you're in a lab setting or a remote setting, you can be out of the picture. You can be in the next room. You can sit behind the test participant, and people are very good at forgetting there's someone else behind them, or forgetting there's a camera watching them, and so on. People do tend after a few minutes to forget that. If you're in a field research setting, if it's a small closed setting like somebody's kitchen or somebody's home, it's very difficult to do that, but not impossible. We did extensive field research on video gamers, and these were young guys, typically, some women, but mostly men, young men. Typically sitting, they would sit in the middle of their living room or their parents' living room with a big screen TV, and their remote control.
Tell me they were sitting in their underpants and drinking beer.
Not far off. I mean, we had some guys who were, you know, slouched on their bed. We had one guy who was in bed. He was in bed when we got there playing video, and we sort of sat in one corner while he laid in bed playing video. He certainly wasn't troubled by our being there. So I think to the extent you physically can get out of the line of sight when you're observing, it's different if you're interviewing, asking questions, but if you're observing, try and get out of the line of sight, you know, hide behind a potted plant or something.
Can I think to that as well, though? I think that there's an ethical issue as well, which is it right that we should not let people know that we're observing them? And I think that, you know, the question isn't. I think what's behind the question is, how can I stop my presence as a researcher? How can I stop that affecting the behaviour that I'm seeing from users? Now that's a different question, I think, to how do we stop users knowing that we're observing them? Because I think users should know that they're being observed. At least, I think they'll forget it. Like, I think Philip's point is that when people start on a task, they kind of get into the task and they kind of they forget really that it's part of a usability test a lot of the time. But I think the question about whether or not we should stop people knowing that they're being observed is a different one. I don't think we should. I think, you know, I think it's not an ethic. I don't think that's ethical behaviour.
Yeah, no, I agree on that. Yeah.
Just a few more things. Nicola is asking a general question, which can be valuable for the entire group. I am introducing an intern to the role of UX. At the moment, she's been given various tasks to support research, but she's struggling to see the big picture. Are there any resources you recommend to help explain the landscape of UX roles and help her understand how her practical skills fit? So is there a landscape of UX roles she might do some desk research in?
Oh, yeah. I think this is it's difficult because the field at the moment is in such transition. I think that there are two types of organisation. There's one type of organisation that thinks of user experience as a singular discipline. So they conflate user experience design and user experience research as the same thing. And those kind of people want a kind of a UX team of one. They want one person to come in and do everything, do the research, design the screens, maybe even do the front end design as well. And that, in that world, there's really the landscape of user research roles. There's one role, user experience person. Now the other type of company, and those are the ones that are much more sophisticated in terms of user experience, I'm thinking of companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google. In the UK, it would be the UK government as well, which is a big employer of people in these different roles. They realise that the best teams work when we create roles that are more specialised. So, for example, there'll be a user experience, there'll be a design function, there'll be a research function, there'll be a front-end developer function. And the problem that I think the intern's going to face is that he or she, when she goes out to do the desk research, will face these, will have this contradiction. She'll see that some companies think of it in terms of one role, and indeed some recruiters think of it in terms of one role, and other companies think of it in terms of these of having these separate specialised functions. So that was a long-winded way of saying I don't know of a particular resource, and I do think it's confusing, and I think I can understand why your intern requires that support. Well, I think what I'd suggest is that you coach that person to understand that there are these two separate directions that it goes in.
Yeah, it can be very frustrating if you're looking for a job. They want people to do the front-end coding, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, Angular, and the UX research, and the design.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be very frustrating.
That can often be a red flag. If you see a job advert
Exactly.
Expecting you to do all of those things, it's a good sign, a good signal that the company doesn't really understand UX. That's not to say you shouldn't apply for the job, but in applying for it and being interviewed for it, you might want to sort of try and reset their expectations about what your role would be and carve the role out for yourself.
Yeah. Have we got time for one more question?
Actually, the one thing I was going to add, can I add one thing to it, which is in the book. There's a diagram that we've included in one of the chapters, which is titled A Tool for Assessing and Developing the Technical Skills of User Experience Practitioners. It's on page 248 of the book. And that describes the various competencies in the field of user experience and splits them into different areas. And I'd recommend, obviously, I'm going to recommend that as a good source to go to. So page 248.
Great answer. There's also this question. Let's see where it is. It popped back up again. Let's see. Need to try to find it again. Is design research different from user research?
No, I think the two terms are...
I've got to be honest.
Sorry, Philip, you go.
Yeah. I've like everyone else, I've struggled with all of these job titles and designations. I think there's design, and I think there's research. That's maybe I'm just oversimplifying it. I think design research is UX research because design is about people. Design is about users. You're designing it for someone to use or interact with, or it's like an architect designing a building for someone to walk through or to live in. So I think it's a slightly fabricated or made up distinction. There's design researchers and UX researchers.
No, I think it kind of tells you more about where somebody got on the bus, really, as to whether they call it user research or design research. Because I think if you said to someone, I'm doing design research, that might mean I'm looking at competitor products. I'm looking at a range of ways people have represented the metaphor of printing in different products because I'm going to try and work out what that should be like in my product that I'm designing. In other words, you could do design research in the absence of involving any users. And I think that's a danger if you call it design research, because you could do design research and never speak to a user. Whereas if you do user research, obviously there's a clue in the title, you're probably going to be involving users when you do that. So I think there could be a difference. But generally, like Philip says, I would say that there's there's design and there's research, and the two are extremely complementary. Design research and user research to me are the same. If someone is arguing that they're different, I'd worry that they were then trying to do research in the absence of users, which would concern me.
Can I ask David, Philip, another question?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is a question by Daniel. Can you please tell me a few open-ended questions you always ask in product discovery interviews in order to learn more about the problem space? So product discovery interviews, are there some questions you always ask, you find yourself asking again and again?
It's a tricky one off the top of my head. I don't think I don't go into product research or whether it's field research or user testing with a specific set of open-ended questions. The implicit question is what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish with whatever the system is, whatever the product is, whether it's a hand tool or a piece of machinery or a consumer product. And ultimately, thinking about this a little further, there are three sort of questions we need answers to when we think about UX research, any kind of UX research. So we need to be able to answer the question who, doing what, under what circumstances. If we can build a story around those three things, who, doing what, under what circumstances, that fills out and completes the sort of UX research picture. But I think in an actual study, I already know who, and I already know under what circumstances, because those are part of the study design. And I want to know, what are you trying to achieve? What is your goal here? If I've given them a task, I would want to know, is that task realistic? Is that something you would do? We've run many studies where we've given them tasks that are supported by the system or by the product, and people have been able to do them quite easily, no problem. But then they say, you know what, in my job, I would never actually do that. I would never use this product the way you just asked me to use it. And that can be revealing, and that can have the design team going all the way back to the drawing board again.
Yeah. And you, David, do you have specific questions you find yourself asking again and again?
I find that there is one question that I'll always ask, which is, can you show me how you? And then I'll fill in the dots depending on the situation. But I think there's a risk that I often see in people that are first doing discovery research, which is that they think they need to go into sessions with long lists of questions. They'll spend a long time really obsessing over the right questions to ask. They think that there's a right way of asking the question, that if only they can phrase it properly, if only they can uncover the right question, then they'll come back with all of the data they need to design the product properly. And as a consequence,
that's actually another question. What's the secret sauce?
So the secret sauce is to not think of it as a Q&A, but to think of it as a framework for eliciting your understanding of what the users are doing. And the best way of doing that, there's two techniques that I tend to use. The first is to ask for a demonstration. Can you show me how you? So let's say I'm interested in knowing how somebody uses, let's say I'm designing a musical instrument interface, like a MIDI interface or something. I don't know where this idea has come from. It's just entered my head. But let's say I am. I would then say to someone, can you show me how you go about writing songs? Can you show me how you go about deciding which song to write? Can you show me how you go about using an instrument? Can you show me how you go about connecting your instrument to the computer? All of those kind of questions around that area. And the other technique that I'll use is I'll ask people to tell me a story when they're in context. So I'll say to them, can you tell me about a time when, and then I might say, for example, a time when the musical instrument didn't connect properly to the computer? Or can you tell me about a time when you really struggled to come up with a new idea for a song? And then the good thing about that is when you ask somebody a story, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you don't need any more questions. All you need to say is, what happened next? And then what happened next? Or you can say, well, what happened before that? And what happened before that? So you actually only need to go in with 2 questions. Can you tell me about a time when? And then you can explore that, but as you let them tell the story. And can you show me how you? And then you can see the way they go about doing the task. And that will work in any situation for any product. And then it prevents you having to be obsessive about the questions you ask. But it also gives you as a user researcher a kind of a safety net, because nobody wants to go into a situation like that kind of naked. What I mean by that, in the sense that they feel very vulnerable because they feel that they're meant to be in charge of the session. Instead, you've still got the control that you know how to run the session, but at the same time, you're allowing yourself to discover what you don't know you don't know. If you go in with specific questions, you're only going to discover the things that you know you don't know because you've phrased those questions already. And they're not the interesting things. The interesting things are the ones that you don't know you should ask. And those kind of questions come by observation and by getting people to tell you about their experiences.
All right, thank you. So we've originally had an hour. We're 15 minutes over.
We could do one more, I think.
So shall we have a look at one more? Let's see. We've had that one. There's a nice question from Sachin. Considering a large industry navigating through bureaucracy, how would you systematically integrate UX mindset in everything we do? And it would be preferable if you have a personal example of a large industry in a bureaucracy, trying to get a UX mindset.
Yeah, I think the important thing, and I've tried to do this, is to find a UX champion in that organization, someone that's at a relatively high level, VP level, preferably. Someone who gets it, understands UX, is passionate about UX, and those people do exist. You know, CEOs of companies, VPs of companies read UX stuff. They know about UX most of the time. Most folks do. So identify one of those people in your organization, meet them, introduce yourself, talk to them about UX, get them on your side. Find the people who look after the budgets, hold the purse strings, so somebody at VP level. It's very difficult to push UX up through an organization. It's much easier to find someone up at the top and work with them to sort of pull it up through the organization. It's like trying to push a piece of string up a hill. Very difficult, much easier to pull it from the top.
Right. So get a champion at a high level.
Yes.
And, making them your ambassador. Exactly.
Someone who's passionate and can evangelize UX through the organization with your help.
Well, excellent answers. We've got people dropping out now because we're stretching the time. So I don't know if there's anything, David, you'd like to wrap up with?
I simply wanted to say thank you, Marco, for your help today. I really appreciate the role you've provided in anchoring the Q&A. So thanks for that. And if anybody has, if I haven't answered your question, and if Philip hasn't answered your question, one thing that I'm going to be doing is going through the chat and the Q&A. And if there's anything particularly fascinating, I might turn them into a UX tea break video. So you may find me answering the question in one of the future tea break videos, which are on YouTube.
What's the channel's name?
It's called, if you do a search for UX tea break, TEA as in cup of tea, UX tea break, I think it should be it should come up first on YouTube. I can't believe someone else has got UXT break, have they? Tell me they haven't, Marco. That'll ruin my day.
They might now. Oh, I've got it here. I'll just paste in URL in the chat log so anybody can find you there. Okay, guys, it's in the chat log. I see a lot of people signing out, but it's in the chat log. Follow David on YouTube.
Okay, anything final you wanted to add, Philip?
No, I think thanks to everybody for tuning in. It's been
Philip
fun.
is on Twitter as well. What's your handle, Philip?
At BP Usability.
All right.
BP for Blueprint. BP Usability.
Thanks. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I wanted them to know your handle. You were talking.
No, I think we were done.
Yeah, I think Philip was just rolling out. Right. So thanks everyone, and keep in touch, and we're signing off now. So farewell from us.